Welcome to episode 119 of the XrmToolCast. In this episode, Scott and I speak with Grant Archibald about the PowerFx test engine. It's an extremely ambitious and extremely a shut up and take my money type of project. So if you have a PowerFx, and I can almost guarantee you have it set up automated tested for it, even though you know you should, this definitely becomes the episode that you must watch. So sit back, relax, and let's get started. Hello and welcome to another episode of the XrmToolCast. With me, your host, Daryl, always raising the bar, and Scott, fade to gray. Scott, how's it going? And I guess it's not gray, but you're fading from green at least. It's beginning to, your age is starting to catch up with you. Like, you know, I went and got my eyes checked. They said, hey, do you want reading glasses? I was like, what? I don't need reading glasses. And like, well, let me see. And I was like, oh, dang it. I'm just beginning. I'm denying it for a while, at least another year before I actually do the reading glass things. But yes, it's catching up with me.
Well, you know, it happens to us all. It's inevitable, Daryl. You know, but as soon as some people start to say, "Yeah, I can see your roots, Scott," it's time for me to go to see my hairdressers. So, I mean, it's a very new experience for me. These things, and then sometimes people will just message me after I've done a video, like, "Wait, what's going on with your hair?" There's like, you know, it's not green. What you need to fix that. Fix that now.
They don't know who you are anymore, huh?
Yeah, yes, exactly. No one's going to recognize me. It's like, who is this strange person with orange hair walking around, or slightly graying orange
Do you have you thought of like changing to a different color or maybe testing that out?
Well, there is Color Cloud coming up actually in Hamburg, and that was obviously the origin story for it. So who knows? Who knows? Watch this space. What about you? I mean, you could go all in, you know.
I could go all in, but it's eventually going to fall all out. I just know it. Like it's just Boulder and Boulder. It's creeping up. It's like the continental drift. It's just going up, and I'll be looking like Mark Smith or George Davinsky.
Yeah, I would say that's a pretty good cohort to be associated with.
Yeah, I'll be proud to be in there when I'm there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll hold on to it as long as I can.
Yeah, definitely. We can. Yeah. Well, I was waiting for a segue, really. I mean, I was waiting for some sort of like feline jokes, or, you know, paw prints, or, you know, I was waiting for.
Well, I tried to give you one with testing different hair colors. We tried. All right, no segue. We'll just go straight to our guests. We don't have to worry about making it pretty this time, I guess. We're out of practice. We need to get back into practice. I think that's what we need to do. So anyway, our guest for today is Grant Archibald. He is the Senior Program Manager at Microsoft, PowerFx, Power Automate, and Dataverse. Grant, welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys. Great to be here.
Awesome.
Yes.
Now, I do have a son named Grant, but I didn't name him after you. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, you know, it depends where you put it in the world. It's Grant or Grant. So, you know, it depends which part of the world you go. It's like,
that's good. I'm pleased, actually, that you said that, because my name is Scott, but most people will call me Scott. So, you know, I'm pleased. Yes, it's Daryl. Yeah. What did you say?
Squat.
It's that's nearly as good as Kendra's British accent from Powerful Devs. And, you know, maybe that's the segue, right? So we're just doing this in reverse. The segue is Powerful Devs and Kendra's British accent, where she said cheerio. And we had Grant and I hung out. It was really good to see you in Seattle. And you were talking about, tell everyone what you were talking about, Grant.
I was talking about low-code testing in the Power Platform. Something we've been doing for decades in the code first land is like, how do we bring a lot of that knowledge that people have been thinking about from that world, and how do you bring it to a whole group of new humans that's not their day job? They want to go build a low-code app and get it working. But, you know, as we get more enterprise-grade apps, you're going to think, okay, there's common patterns that people have been doing for decades in terms of how do you test an app? How do you make sure it continues to go? How do you keep your great idea alive?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, maybe you could tell us a little bit about PowerCat in a minute, but because you're talking about that and testing, do you have an elevator pitch where you would try and convince people that testing and specifically like automated UI testing, I think, because that's one of the things that people will often say the returns aren't justifying the effort that you have to go into it, right? Unit testing, when you're writing C# or TypeScript, there's a lower barrier, right? There's a lot more knowledge out there, a lot more frameworks and stuff. But, if somebody says, I haven't got time to do UI testing in Power Platform. Well, if I was stuck in an elevator, for a few minutes with you, Grant, it's not actually happened yet. But, if it was, and you were to convince me, what would you say?
I think it depends. I mean, I go back to one of what a PM kind of said to me years ago when I started my career. It's like, it's like pushing like a metaphorical boulder up a hill. Like the more and more you push this boulder up and it becomes more and more important to you, you need more and more people behind it to hold it there. And the question is, do you want to spend your time holding that boulder, or do you want to put a backstop behind that boulder and you want to move quickly because you know that it's just going to stay there and you can keep moving it with confidence? So it's like, where do you want to spend your time? Like, how important is this thing to you? And how important is it? Is it just your personal productivity? Or is it something that say, hey, a lot of my organization is depending on this? If a lot of my organization is depending on it, you're going to go, okay, well, I'm going to spend more effort making sure it works. Maybe I want to hand this across to my support team. I want them to manage this. I want to make sure it's alive. So there's a kind of difference between one end of the spectrum is my personal productivity thing. It's just my app to go into my expenses versus it's my company-wide app that I'm using to go manage my expenses. And it's maybe more than my app. It's my agent. It's my Dataverse. It's all of these things working together. And how do you verify all those things work together by itself and collectively to make sure it works as a solution?
Yeah, so I'm pushing this boulder up the hill, and like you're saying, you've got that backstop to stop it rolling backwards. So you're sort of like talking about regression testing.
Yeah, regression testing, and also just ability to move quickly. Like I know I can move a whole lot quicker if I know it's going to not roll back down the hill behind me. So it's like, I want to move quickly. How do I put this barrier behind it to say, okay, I can quickly go, okay, I want to move a bit ahead. I can go to the side, do some experiments, and then quickly jump ahead. I've got confidence that boulder is not going anywhere. So it's not just regression testing. It's like, I want the ability to make sure I can move and innovate quickly and make sure things still work, even though I've got this boulder behind me and it's doing a lot of awesome work for me. So it's like, that's kind of the analogy that I kind of think about. It's like, where do you, as the size of that boulder increases, becomes more and more important to me and my organization. What's that metaphorical backstop behind it to make sure it still works?
That's really interesting. I like that analogy. Actually, it was because we've had snow recently, right? And I was driving past a big park, local park, and it just reminded me of when I was a kid. When it's snowing, the first thing you go out is you get like a snowball and you start to roll it along the floor, along the field, right? And then it gets bigger and bigger, and then you get all your friends, and then like you're pushing this humongous, massive, great snowball along, and it's picking up all this snow as you go. And so that's the thing about projects, isn't it? They do inevitably get bigger and bigger and bigger the longer you're kind of pushing them forwards. And so it's interesting you're saying about like that backstop so that you can be agile and you can create things quickly, because it's the irony is, of course, the reason why people don't do testing is because they'll often say it takes too long to build the tests to test the things that I'm building. So it's like, okay, well, it's Power Platform, it's low code. I should be able to just go and create these things. I don't want to have to then go and think, oh, how do I build it? So, and you mentioned that, okay, for personal productivity, it doesn't make sense. But for something where your organization is relying on you, that's where it starts to become so much more mission critical. And so it's almost like you suggesting that you have to think about the cost of building as always building in the cost of tests. Is that the equation? At what level, when the snowball gets to what size does it have to get to?
I mean, I think there's multiple levels. I mean, it's that snowball starts kind of growing. There's one person doesn't want to be a victim of their own success. Like, I create a fantastic idea and it's having really great impact on my organization. How do I hand that to a support team? How do they feel comfortable taking it over? So that's kind of one kind of persona. And then, okay, maybe it really truly is growing to my whole organization level. At that point, you want to go, how do I make the testing process as easy as building the low-code app itself? Because I've had feedback from customers going, hey, I can rapidly build an app or an automation, but I spend longer testing it because I'm using some of my traditional pro-code tools to go test a low-code tool. And you're going to go like, okay, how do you get that balance to bring the simplicity of what the Power Platform brings and something like Copilot Studio, but how do you do it in a way that you also make the testing process as simple as the tools we take to build it? So I think some of that is just choosing the right tool for the right job to achieve the same goal. You still want that metaphorical backstop, but the question is, how do you achieve it in a way that you don't spend longer testing it than the time building it? Because that ROI discussion becomes harder. Whereas if we can simplify that process and make it much easier to create that test, you're more likely to go create it. And it's more likely to be there, and it's going to be that backstop that your support team can rely on, you can rely on, your organization can rely on to make sure whatever you've built still it stays alive. And not just in your first year of deployment, but how does it continue to work in year 2, 3, 4, 5? So it continues to add value over time, not just, yay, I got something deployed, but how do I give it a sustainability model, which is in the code first world, that's a really common DevOps pattern. Like, I want a sustainability model to make sure whatever I'm doing works. As the platform changes, as my business requirements change, how do I verify it still works? And I think the same thing needs to be done for low code. Like, okay, we're super rapidly changing around the platform, adding a whole bunch of new features like AI features and platform features to make the platform better. Business requirements are changing. All of those things together makes it really quick to change. But then you don't want to be, hey, my manager's looking at this tomorrow. My CIO is looking at this tomorrow. How do I change it from a reactive conversation to a proactive conversation where I can say, hey, I know this thing broke. I can proactively get notified that it broke, fix it, and before someone even looks at it, you've resolved the problem. As opposed to, I've got this great idea, and I don't know it's broken until somebody important opens it up or raises a support ticket.
Yeah.
And, how do you make that process, that operational side of it, so much easier to do?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that's so powerful, knowing that something's broken before it actually gets notified. You get notified from your customers or your users. I mean, that's huge. But the story always is, it's just too hard with Power Platform. So, which is what I was really enjoyed the Powerful Dev session you did, because you were showing some of the investments, some of the developments in this area, which I think are going to make it easier to do what you just described for people. Could you make a sort of, give people a summary of sort of what new investments are being made, what you're working on, etc.?
If it's stuff that's come out already, or is it stuff that you're trying to get out, or where is it at too, would be helpful.
Yeah, so at the moment, we're just about to go to preview around some of the things. And starting with PowerApps, so we've done a lot of investments in PowerApps. So if you think back years ago, we started with like a generative AI to say, okay, I want to take natural language and generate PowerFx. So to help you with those expressions when you want to build a Power App. And eventually you can see the arc of testing will go on the same thing. Like at one end of the spectrum, I've got a maker that wants to use my natural language to say, hey, as I build a plan, and the next logical evolution for that is I describe out what occurs, I'm going to say, how would I describe the tests that go alongside that? So when I go through my plan, I go build it, I test it, I deploy it, I monitor it. Like, we know what that story looks like. How do you build for that operational process? But we're starting with PowerApps first, because that's been a lot of investment around that. But we're trying to make it modular, that you can have different providers turning up. So starting with Canvas apps, we're going to model apps. We're looking at Microsoft Copilot Studio. We're looking at Dataverse. We're looking at Power Automate. How do we enable those different parts of the product to plug in their own testing model for that makes sense, but have a common approach of using PowerFx across that? And some of the things why PowerFx is, it's a simple language compared to something like C# or Java or Python, which it makes it easier to write and also AI generate. You can validate that the language works, and you can extend the language. So you can go add in your own PowerFx testing actions. So we add, say, PowerFx testing actions for Microsoft Copilot Studio or Power Apps or Power Automate. So you can extend the language to say, I want to go test different concepts that make sense for each of those different parts of the platform. So that's one of the key things we've looked at is like, how do we just move it beyond I'm clicking on a button or interacting with a grid to I want to go interact with different parts of the Power Platform. So for example, if I was doing a Power Automate flow, one of the prototypes we've got is I want to simulate triggering an automation or an agent and say, okay, now I want to go verify if I mocked out the connectors, what the logic flow through that automation flow would look like. Or if I'm trying to go connect with Dataverse, I might want to say, how I want to go do integration testing of creating, updating, deleting, or executing a function. If I'm interacting with Copilot, either a conversational Copilot, I might want to assert that a greeting is received. I want to go into some text and I want to say, how do I validate the generative AI that maybe came back based on my knowledge sources? And then you kind of come back to kind of where we are at the moment, where I want to go interact with the entity list of a model-driven application, open up an entity, save that entity, verify that got saved to Dataverse. And so that's kind of more integration testing level, but there's also from a unit testing level, say, okay, how would I open up a Power App and how would I isolate it off so I can go simulate when it talks to a connector or Dataverse? So that you can do more of a classical kind of unit test. So I want to say, how does this app behave when I simulate the weather connection? And if the weather's hot, how does my app respond? If the weather's cold, how does it respond? What happens if the weather returns an exception that I didn't expect? How does my app respond to that? Which are kind of classical kinds of things you think about, happy path tests, edge cases, exceptions, and you can go control those inputs and outputs and go see how does my app behave as you change those different variables. And kind of do that all in low code so that it can observe based on what you're doing and create a series of PowerFx steps representing that action. And then think about, okay, how would you go extend that for those different kind of combinations?
How does this relate to what we have today, which is Test Studio in PowerApps? That's probably what listeners are probably used to seeing. You can go into the test tools and you can record what you're doing, and then that does create those PowerFX expressions that you can then evaluate and based on if they're true. How is what you're talking about there? Because I'm very excited about the fact that you're saying that it's a modular sort of component-based approach where you can test across multiple different Power Platform components. Like Plan Designer is great because you can create a plan and then it will suggest Power Apps and flows and Dataverse tables. It's unifying the maker experience into a single kind of pane of glass, as it were. At the moment, Test Studio is sort of built into Power Apps. So how is what you're talking about going to evolve to be more like Plan Designer in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, if you're going to look at Test Studio, we released that back in 2023. It was focused on Canvas apps only, didn't have support model-driven applications. So even within the space of Canvas apps, Power Apps, it was limited. And then it's like, okay, how do you extend it even to have a provider model that covers the different types of Power Apps? Then as we went through that, we said, okay, how do we re-architect? So we ended up rebuilding all the provider model using the managed extensibility framework. So you can go create each of these different providers as different extensibility providers with a common things that you have to do all the time, like creating a test or logging or authentication, just become common elements that you can take advantage of. And then on top of that, go add in different providers for different parts of the platform. But still have that common PowerFX language that you can use and extend to say, how do you go test things that are kind of common across each of those providers, or maybe they're provider specific. So that's kind of the key change that we've made from where Test Studio was Canvas apps only. Test Engine, which is a new project that was created 2 years ago and was about to get updated, has now got this re-architecture to say, yes, it covers these different parts of Power Apps, but because of the work we've done, we can now enable other parts of the platform to join in and just add their own provider for their different part of the platform and extend the language to say, if there's actions that are specific to your part of the platform, we can just go extend it out. And as we go forward, what we'll see is, we as a platform, we have different types of way of interacting. We can see customers saying, hey, I want to go create something specifically for finance or health. And maybe there's concepts or testing things that make sense for them. They could go extend out to create a kind of a more just domain-specific language to say, these are the testing blocks that make sense for maybe me as an organization. And I want to encapsulate those pieces together to make it easier for people to test. So that's kind of the journey we've kind of gone on. And you'll see if you look at Test Engine, there's been a lot of work we've been doing in some of the integration branches, and that's about to go into the mainline version of the code. And that will soon turn back up in the command line tool. But we're not really just stopping at the command line tool. We're looking to say, how do you do that in the browser today, like Test Studio does? So you can author and run kind of dry runs of your test in the browser without any tooling available at all. You could drop down to Visual Studio Code and you could go edit it there if that's your tool of choice. And you go commit that to, say, a Git repository and say, okay, now I want that integrated into pipelines. So I can have a gated build. So before I go from dev to test to production, I want to make sure that my automated tests are all running, and I can make that a business decision to say, do I want to accept or reject the deployment to production, to making sure that all my automated tests have run? What are the changes that I made? And then use it as a quality gate to go between the different environments.
I feel like there's we've kind of covered a lot of abstract things, and I'm having trouble figuring out exactly where how this is actually going to work. So we have the test engine that we're working on, that you're looking to preview. Is that what's in the preview sections of the test engine?
Yeah, it's currently in preview. It's just about to go to preview.
Okay. All right. So then that is what is being utilized to be able to, you can extend it, it sounds like. You can also utilize it for a lot of the out-of-the-box stuff as well. So if we take a simple Canvas app that does some CRUD of a contact in Dataverse, like we can do just front-end testing where we just validate, if I click this button, then it shows up this way in the app. And we can do more integrated testing where, hey, when I push this button to create, it should create a record in Dataverse. So it does, like, it can do both of those things. It can do both kind of the integration stuff and the heavy UI, not integration, unit testing stuff.
Yeah, I think it's a spectrum of that. Like like you do in kind of classical kind of code first testing, you could say, okay, I want to do a more unit test. I want to go check, does the app behave as I expected, independent of my individual data? So I could say, hey, when you call the account entity, it should return no account. And then I want to go test the behavior of my entity list that it handles an empty list. Or maybe I want to change my entity list to say, what happens when I've got 50 items and how does it work? So that's kind of more integration testing where I'm controlling my inputs and outputs and my connectors. And then I might want to do more of an integration test where I might say, okay, I really want to go save to database. I want to save my account. And as a result of that account getting created, maybe a plugin gets created, runs that will automatically generate an account summary. And I want to validate that account summary record got created with the correct information inside it, which would be more of an integration test. And then I may have more of an end-to-end test where I might say, okay, I want to go start with a copilot, run some conversations, which at the end of that, it should hand off to an agent. And I want to summarize that this particular summary record got created in Dataverse, which would be more of an example of integration test where I've got multiple pieces I need to join together to test that overall process. And the further you shift towards the right, the more it would need to validate all those pieces, and it becomes probably bigger and harder to manage and maintain that end-to-end test versus saying, how do I enable you to test each of those individual pieces in isolation? And then when I join them together, I've got confidence each of these components work by themselves. So it's kind of decomposing it into smaller little pieces where I can create a test for each of those components to make sure they work individually with all the different edge cases I can think about. So when I join them together, I have a confidence that the app, Dataverse, Power Automate, the Copilot all work with these different kind of combinations. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I guess the other question then is, how are you doing that? How are you saying, okay, if I have these 20 records, I want this to be what it does. Is that like Is it like editing stuff in a grid? Is it uploading a CSV file? Is it mainly going through and doing something and say, this is how you create those? Like, what does that UI look like for the user?
So at the moment, our current focus has been more on the code first, developer first. So, and we're kind of just working with that because we've starting with PowerFx and YAML files, the way that we represent those tests. So those individual actions of opening up a form, selecting an item out of the list, editing it would be a series of steps which you do on a cert. Over time, we also want to make that kind of maker experience where they just go interact with the app. It observes what you're doing and automatically generates that PowerFx behind the scenes.
All right. So currently it's PowerFx that you're utilizing.
So it's PowerFx at the moment. And the reason we're choosing PowerFx is, say if you compare it to something like Playwright, for example. So Playwright, for the folks that haven't heard about it, is a kind of a lower level tool that Microsoft creates to automate a browser. And normally you go interact with the document object model. So you can say, okay, I want to go click on a particular item in the list, and I want to make sure that this element appears on the page. Whereas in Test Engine, what we're doing is we're abstracting that. It's like, I want to just go select this button. And under the hood, we know the client JavaScript object model of what that button does, and we act on the JavaScript object model where possible, because the JavaScript object model is a bit more resilient compared to the way that the document object model may render things. So that level of abstraction hides away the way that we kind of create the individual rendering of that button or that grid. So it gives you kind of resiliency rather than going, oh no, Microsoft changed the way that we named a control, the way that appears on the page. So PowerFx gives you that abstraction layer, and it also makes it easier for us to generate that process because it's a well-known language. We're not having to write a whole lot of low-level C# to go represent the document object model. We just say, I want to go select something. I want to go open something. And then under the hood, that can then abstract whatever opening or selecting means.
Yeah, the test creator is focusing on the what, not the how, because you're using PowerFX to abstract that away.
And that's the thing I found really useful. Go, Scott.
And the test creator is I mean, that's an interesting question in my mind, and I just want to sort of ask your opinion on it. Is that at the moment, the way it is at the moment, we have Test Studio and it's in Power Apps. Okay, so I mean, you've talked about unit testing, you've talked about integration tests, sort of end-to-end tests. So when you are testing an app, then it would make sense to have your tests inside your app. And actually, if you're writing TypeScript tests, you quite often have a tests folder underneath in the same folder that the code you're actually testing. And obviously, if it's a C#, you'd have a separate test project, but it would be in the same solution, right? So there is an affinity between the unit that you are testing and the tests that are testing that unit. Whereas when you were talking more integration tests, end-to-end tests, what's your view on how that may end up looking from the sort of the reality of somebody building solutions in Power Platform? Because at the moment we have a solution and that can have many different components. We've got Cloud Flows, Power Apps, MCS Copilot agents. And we've got Plan Designer, of course, which is allowing you to sort of describe what you want. I mean, are you seeing there going to be two worlds of building tests? I mean, like something maybe where Plan Designer creates end-to-end tests, but then you can also go and create unit tests inside a particular application? Or do you see it all being just like one thing, and it's like, it doesn't matter if you're writing unit tests or end-to-end tests, you just do it in this one area, and it's one size fits all?
I mean, it's a great question. I think it's going to be like, take Plan Designer as an example. I can imagine as we evolve the story, today I can say, I want to go create a hotel booking application. And within that hotel booking application, I've got a data model, I have an app on top of it, maybe I have an agent that interacts with someone. So there's these different components that we get created. And as part of that, I can imagine saying, hey, what if it could automatically go generate the high level outcomes that I want to go validate? And then as I go into that, like today, I go build a Power Automate Cloud Flow, automatically there's a set of actions I create, which I can say, maybe that's not quite correct. I can go modify that. So I'd use natural language to go modify that flow. I can imagine the same thing being applied to a test, where you could go, okay, I want to say the outcome of what I've got, I know my data model, I know my domain model, I know the personas that I've got. Given those things, I could say, because we've got like personas built into testing, say, as a user that is not authenticated, this is the experience that should occur if I go to this app or this flow. As a user that is authenticated, I should be able to open the app and I should be able to do features A, B, and C because I'm a normal user. As an administrator, I should be able to delete records or approve records because I've got additional capabilities. So those personas, I think, are super important, that to say, depending on who you are, what you're going to do is change. And it could automatically generate those very similar to the way it would go build an asset. And then as you get into that, you'd open it up, as you say, as maybe you're in the app, you say, here's my app. These are the different test scenarios that I could think of. Like in my booking example, I say, what happens if I book at the start of the month? What happens if occupancy is full? What happens, could I suggest another similar thing? So there's been different edge cases of scenarios where a lot of people tend to think of what I'd call the happy path. Like, what happens if everything goes completely fantastic? But what happens if the room is full? What happens if I've suddenly got an extra 5 people that I want to join? So I want to upgrade and I'll get multiple rooms, but I want to make sure they're adjoining. Or if I've got a family, or what if I'm booking as a sports team? You know, as a sports team, maybe I want to book on a floor of a building because I want the whole team to be together. I don't want to be spread out across the whole hotel. Mm. So there's lots of different variations you could do as you refine, saying, what do I want to achieve? Naturally, the test personas and the actions and the different components that you've got would need to go say, how do you check tests for those different scenarios? So I think in some ways it's a natural evolution.
Yeah, so it sounds like then what you're saying is the way you envisage it is being more that you have, scenario-based tests that you can then associate to different components in your solution. Of course, and that naturally lends itself to a plan designer-led architecture or solution design rather than a component-specific style unit test like we have with Power Apps Test Studio, right? Which the test is intrinsically contained within that app, rather than it being more of a scenario where, this scenario spans this cloud flow, this app, this set of Dataverse tables.
I think it'd be a bit of both. There'll be one that's the overall approach, like what's the job to be done that I'm trying to achieve? But within that job to be done, there's going to be small components that do different parts of that process. Like I'm going to be testing the app part of that process, or the Dataverse part of that process, or the conversational agent part of that process. Each of those components will be part of that overall job to be done. I want to book a room. Like that's my job to be done. I want to get a room booked, and depending on the inputs that I give it, that's going to change my job to be done. I want to book for individually. I want to go book for a family. I want to go book for a sports team. Those are all different scenarios. And within that, you then go, okay, what are the sub pieces of like how you would do that process? So I think there'll be just different levels of elevation. Yes, there's the overall story, and then we'll be broken down to pieces of that. And then within that, you might say, okay, I want to go set Dataverse in a known state. I want to then go run these series of tests, and I want to assert at the end of it that it did, the outcome got achieved. Maybe we have less of those tests, and then we'll say, okay, maybe we've got more of our tests written around specifically around the app, or around the automation flow, or around Dataverse, or around the Copilot Studio. So there'll be different levels of tests to go verify the system when you put it together.
And that does seem like a natural way of working in a cloud-based environment like Power Platform, where you have such or you have an environment, right? It's not like TypeScript where you can just write some TypeScript and run it locally. There needs to be that scaffolding around your tests, and having all of those abilities that you're just talking about, like the ability to set Dataverse into a known environment, a known state, being able to do security role kind of testing, being able to validate that certain things have happened, is very much in the ethos of Power Platform. It's making it easier for you to write tests. I mean, ultimately, that's what we're talking about, isn't it? If you're writing pro code, then you're still going to write tests doing that. That's not going to change. But ultimately, what we're doing is we're creating a much more homogenized environment for creating tests that allows us to span all these different components. It sounds like music to my ears. I mean, Daryl, would you kind of go, actually, I don't need to do write C# plugin test or TypeScript test? Would you drop all of your kind of testing approaches, or and go, right, I'm just going to use that?
So here's the fun approach, right? Because when we think of our pro dev lifecycle, we've got 30, 40 plus years of developers working as developers to create tooling for developers, so developers can be better developers. We have this whole hierarchy that's in place. And when we're in the Power Platform space, we don't have 40 years. We've got 10-ish. Maybe that's being generous. It's more like 5. I don't know. It looked really different a decade ago than it does now. And so there's that. There's those steps that need to be taken, and we're getting closer to that, but it still doesn't replace the other stuff that exists out there, because in the pro dev world, you can utilize that as a test first approach, as you use your test to drive your development. I'm not quite sure that from what I'm hearing from Grant, that you can quite do that the other way around with the low code approach. Can you write your tests and then code to actually make your tests pass?
You could do. I mean, I think Scott kind of alluded to in terms of like, where are we going with Plan Designer? Like, I could say, I want the intent. If you go back to like something like behavior-driven development in a code first world, so as an administrator, I expect to be able to go save an order, and I should be able to delete the order because I'm an administrator. As a normal user, I should not be able to delete an order. I should only be able to mark it as deleted. As a non-authenticated user, I should not be able to even see the order. Like, those are outcomes that you do. And then you take something like a cucumber test, I'd break that down to things that would then enable me to make that work. So there's different levels of test framework that was created for those different levels of abstraction. I could see the same approach applying to test engine also. Whether or not I could imagine, if we created a NuGet version of test engine, I could go wrap that behind my cucumber test and still have a behavior-driven test with outcomes that are still backing onto PowerFx. It's just another level of abstraction. So it's a matter of how far up or down that stack do you want to be, and have that kind of no cliffs extensibility model to say, look, if I want to go down and I want to go use my C# and I'm happy at that level, great. Here's a way of integrating that. If you're a person that says, look, I don't want to go to that level of detail and I just want to stick at the high level job to be done and go write these things for me, it's about you just choosing the right level of elevation and just plug in the skills that I've got. And I think that's, where we could get to eventually.
Which probably depends a lot on what you're testing, what you're doing, right? If we're sending someone to the moon, we have to be very, very careful that every little part works. If we're trying to book a room, and we want to make sure it works, but if it fails and they have to mainly go to some other system or mainly change this or contact somebody once every 2 months, then it's probably not worth the investment to try to make it as completely 100%, the test covered, with perfection being the enemy of the good, right? So it's like, so I guess you have that aspect of it as well, to make sure that you're not knowing what your task is, knowing where you're sitting at, and knowing where your skills are, and making sure that for the business that it makes sense for them at the end of the day.
It kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about like where if the organization is relying on your test, on your application, but it's also what's the impact of the organization not being able to do what it did. So, like if your application is booking a room, what's the impact of that? Okay, maybe someone can't book a room, but they can just go and still use the room, and they could post it on the door. Whereas if you're sending somebody to the moon, then the impact may be a little bit more catastrophic. But you were mentioning cucumber tests, and now I have the segue. I have the segue that we need to overdub on the beginning of this podcast, because you've seen those
38 minutes. We're here.
Yeah, exactly. Have you seen those videos with cats and cucumbers? Have you seen that where you put a cucumber behind a cat and then they freak out? You see, it's Power Cat Cucumber. It's a natural. natural segue.
Yeah, I'm sneaking up behind with the cucumber, and the cat is turning around. I go, "Oh my god, what's this cucumber behind me?" There's the segue. And it also just ties back into your hair at the same time. The whole green loop is just going now. So we're good.
See, it all becomes clear. Goodness me. But we are kind of like 40 minutes in. There was another topic that was intriguing me, and I don't know, Daryl, have you seen the ability to run PowerFx inside the browser, inside a kind of a little sandbox? Have you seen that? What Grant's been?
I've not seen this.
Grant, maybe do you want to sort of tell everyone what you can do there and how it works as well? Because this is the cool bit.
Yeah. So one of the challenges we've got is, like, normally if you go interact with PowerFx, there's a special version that the Power Apps team created and transpiled that whole process across into JavaScript. But there's an open source NuGet package that exists for PowerFx. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges I was looking at is, like, how do I enable people to quickly learn the testing language behind Test Engine? So I want to give them a playground where they could just go type in arbitrary PowerFx and evaluate it directly in the browser. So there's no tools installed. You don't need Visual Studio Code installed. You don't need .NET installed. You just want to go run it. So what I did is, there is WebAssembly as a standard in the browser, and there is .NET WebAssembly. So just taking the NuGet packages of PowerFx, using the .NET WebAssembly to enable you to go execute that in the browser. So we just kind of built a playground based on that. So you could say, I don't need a Power Platform subscription. I don't need anything. All I need is a web page. It just loads up the .NET version of PowerFx into my browser, and then I can interactively build up these little playground experiences and say, hey, here's a simulated version of Dataverse, and I want to go run a series of steps against it, and I want to assert it, and I can just go try it directly inside the browser. So it's very similar to the try it experience we have with C# in the Learn Microsoft platform today. So it's kind of giving that same experience where I've got a concept, and I want to try learn it really, really quickly. I don't want to go set up an environment and import a solution, and 15 minutes later I get to the concept I was trying to learn. It's like, how do I give that immediate feedback straight away with sample state and all ready to go, and you just go try it. And then I want to go immediately change the true to a false, and I want to go try it again, and the test should fail. So that's one of the things we were doing, is like, how do we give an immediacy in the learning process? And as part of that process, we went, okay, we've got this great set of components in NuGet for PowerFx. How do we enable those to run directly in the browser? And the next step we're taking on top of that is, like, how do we enable it to be loaded as a PCF control? So I can take a Power App, I can drop in, say, a version of Test Engine directly onto the web page, and I start authoring my test in the middle of a Power App. So it's kind of gives us a way of using all of the goodness of NuGet components in the browser.
Yeah, and it's like you mentioned WebAssembly there in just passing, and it always blows my mind when you say, I mean, can you just like give a little, just a short time description of what a WebAssembly is? Because it's one of those things you go, wait, what did you just do?
So, yeah, great question. So there's a standard built into the browser called WebAssembly. So kind of think of it like machine code for the browser, where there's a common standard where I can go take a bit of C# or Python or Java or Rust, and I compile it into WebAssembly, a WASM file. And that can be loaded natively. So a lot of all your modern browsers in your desktop, and also increasingly mobile browsers, have support for WebAssembly, and it runs at near native execution speed. And so I can go, there is a version of the .NET compiled for WebAssembly. And because there's a version of .NET compiled for WebAssembly, I can load .NET WebAssemblies that have been compiled as the WebAssembly source, and it can be loaded in the browser. So think of it just like another machine type. Like today, you can go compile for Windows or OS X or Linux. It just becomes another type of environment you can compile for. And that WebAssembly can run client-side in your browser, or it could run server-side. So you can host WebAssembly in .NET or Node on your server side. So it's just a way of expressing this independent of the framework. It'll run both client and server side.
Yeah, I've heard about WebAssembly for a while now. I think it was back in the MVP summit where we were talking about with TypeScript, trying to figure out, should we be going more to WebAssembly or TypeScript? And they were kind of walking through that, but I hadn't heard it explained such well. Me in English, very good, so well. So thank you for that, and I assume our assistant listeners will appreciate that as well. My one concern, I guess, would be, does that mean that there's a large file upload that has to happen or download that has to happen? Because I just spent 16 hours driving back from Florida, and I was trying to do power platform stuff on my phone tethered to my laptop, and it was kind of rough sometimes. It was okay. Yes, this is a slow internet connection. This is trying to develop, and this is rough. So, how's the experience with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, basically it's broken down to small pieces, and it's still using the HTTP cache capability built into your browser. So if I open it up a second time, it'll use the cached version of that. So, it does give you kind of fit into some normal patterns you'd expect with how do you go cache content. So it will work in that way. So once you've downloaded this version of the .NET or the app that it's related to it, it'll use the cached version of that as opposed to go re-downloading that all again a second time.
I'm always a fan of that one-time penalty. Okay, it took a while to load the first time, but then, hey, it's look at your split. So yes, that makes sense. Cool.
So yeah, it's found it really, really useful. I think it opens the possibility of how do we join these two worlds of there's this body of components that are out there. How do you leverage those in a way that, how do you expose those and wrap those in a different way so you can expose that to people that don't need to know how it was written. They just want to take advantage of the capability that it gives you. So that's kind of what this example shows. Hey, I don't need to know how I used WebAssembly. I just want to expose that as a capability for people to go evaluate PowerFx.
And we'll put the links to that playground stuff that you've been working on in the show notes, because it is very cool to be able to see just writing a bit of PowerFx there and there being no document server, no server element to it. It's just running there locally. And I mean, the fact that you can put it into a PCF control is now, and that's quite impressive, because then it opens up some interesting angles. That if you can use PowerFx to actually evaluate client side inside a PCF, it does start to, your brain, well, mine anyway, it starts to go click, 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 click. What other cool things could I do with that?
Scott's going to create Mortal Kombat and PowerFX on a Canvas app in a PCF control. I see this.
I mean, it feels like cheating, really. It's like you're just writing C# and you can run it inside in the browser. It's like, wait, sure.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. One of the things that we're working on is how do we take the test engine is written in .NET. We've got a version of the complete stack of test engine running in the browser with no server side. I just want to go execute that whole stack where we abstract out the file system and just give it a mock file system to run in the browser. But the overall process still works. I can still go interact with the app or interact with a copilot from directly inside this web version of the test. So it kind of creates interesting kind of combinations where I could author the steps I want in a Power App, and then I could go pass it off to this PCF control that could go evaluate it. Without even needing any back-end infrastructure or anything behind that to make that work.
Yeah. It's kind of, the opportunities for then running your tests and doing all of this cool stuff. Presumably you could do that in a CI/CD pipeline as well. I mean, it would not necessarily, what would happen there? Because one of the challenges with CI/CD pipeline testing of UI testing is that you have then to do browser automation, and you have to have a VM or something that you can then farm that out to. And, you've got a lot of processing that has to happen, and you've got to orchestrate all of the creation of the environment, all those kind of things. Is that something that's just going to work? or is there going to be a little bit of more complexity?
I think there's devil in the detail depending on which part of the Power Platform you pick. So we pick PowerApps, for example. It runs in the context of a user. You've got factors like multi-factor authentication to kind of put into this. You've got your conditional access policies. So depending on your security environment, there may be different choices of where you go host that. So, and there are, we've got documentation examples of how you do multi-factor authentication. How would you authenticate? How would you securely store that and share that with a service principal running in a pipeline? How would you think about different hosting locations depending on how your security team have gone and set that up? They may have specific conditional access policies saying these tests must come from these set of build agents running on these IP addresses for these personas only. So you could go to that extreme, or there could just be like, hey, how do I just handle user 1, user 2, user 3 with different types of multi-factor authentication? Because maybe you want to say, user 1 has no rights to the application. User 2 is your happy path. User 3 is your administrator. And you want to go test those 3 different personas differently, depending on the Dataverse roles that are added or which additional services you've got. So yes, there's a lot of, and it's designed to be modular to give you choices depending on where you want to run it. It could be in your browser. It could be from a command line running that from Visual Studio Code. It could be as part of your pipeline. So there's just it's up to you to choose which of those different locations do you want to go run your tests.
Mm-hmm. We always get to a point where we give homework in the XrmToolCast, and
yes, we do. Yes,
and well, my homework for you simply is like, well, when can we have it? Because just like I love the stuff that you showed at Powerful Devs, and but having something that is really sort of this end to end and this fully encompassing, it's when can we have it? I mean, am I allowed to ask that question? I don't know.
Sure, it's always the inevitable question is like, hey, this sounds great, and which parts of that story are going to be available when?
In the fullness of time.
In the fullness of what I would say, it's going to be an evolving story. We want to progressively roll this out. And so at the moment, the most of all those features are using our build from source strategy. So if you want to go build it from our open source GitHub repository, you have all access to the latest and greatest. Then there's kind of what we're going to call our next thing. We're going to release that as part of the Power Platform CLI. And there'll be some features that will be marked as, for wider usage, like our Canvas apps is more mature than some of the new things. Those will be kind of in our preview namespace, and you can opt into using some of the preview features. So it's up to you to say, hey, what's my level? Like if I want to get my job done and some of those are experimental, I'm happy to work with experimental and change. So you're opting into using some of our experimental features versus like, hey, I want this to be generally bedded down. I want this to be established patterns. Maybe you want to stay at that last ring of kind of general availability. So I think it's going to be different levels that people can jump on. Like if I'm an early adopter and I'm happy running it the latest and greatest and the cutting edge, work with the open source version in the source code. And there you'll see there's active work on different features getting implemented all the time. Then there'll be kind of updates to our Power Platform command line interface where there's features there. Some of them will be more baked than others, and you can opt into the preview features. And then lastly, if you want to wait for something that's more mature and move out of that preview phase, that will take longer. So it's kind of that, I'd say that ring deployment model like Windows had of like you choose the ring of speed and change depending on what you're trying to achieve. The left-hand side of that, if you're like a Canary user and I'm happy with the latest bits, rock on. If you say, okay, I don't want to be quite that cutting edge and I still want to take advantage of preview features, opt in some of the preview features. And the last one is like going to be general available. And then within that, I'd say is you'll see each of the features we've got will fit into each of those rings over time. So Canvas is the most mature of those and it's closest to the kind of right-hand side of that spectrum. I know we're on a podcast, but generally say closer towards that features that just work by default. Whereas we're working on features like, how would I do multi-turn testing of conversational agent? Are things that are more at that preview stage. So, and you'll see they'll progress through that process and really want to be driven by our customers saying, what's the most important thing for you to kind of work out, given your job to be done, what are the most important things that you need to test to be successful as an organization? And that's really going to drive our prioritization, saying, which do we invest in first? But because it's an open source model, we could say, hey, have a chat with us, raise an issue, prioritize, give us feedback on our backlog around what are the most important things for you. And we can look at where that fits in our model, but also over time, because it's an open source solution, people can eventually say, hey, this is how I used it. These are the things that I extended it with. Could that become a contribution to help the community?
So there's the call to action for listeners, is to check out the link in the show notes to go to that test engine repo, get it working, and give you feedback, put issues. So we'll have maybe 2 or 3 issues from our 2 or 3 listeners. So
I think 2 or 3 issues. I mean, you could start with the simplest: watch the Powerful Dares video. Just get an idea of what's possible.
We'll put that in the notes as well.
And put that in the list. Have a play with the playground and just say, hey, what does this experience look like without installing anything? Give us feedback of like, hey, what learning paths would you like to see to help you get up and going faster? And then it's like, okay, I want to try the bits. I want to get hands-on with it. I want to try it with these different providers. And go, okay, where are the things could we improve? And over time, we will get better abstractions for the different parts of the Power Platform, and depending on where you are on those ring deployment models.
Well, Grant, I mean, you've given us a whole bunch to think about and to dive into. We probably could have made 3 episodes out of this, but we've pretty much come to the end of our time here. So if our listeners have any questions for you or ways that they'd like to reach out, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Probably the best way is via my LinkedIn. That's where I post a lot of stuff in terms of what's the latest things that we're working on. Here are the changes we've got. So that's one way of interacting. I think the other part, just engaging with the wider team. It is an open source repository. Create questions, create interactions there. So if you go to, and we'll put a list in the show notes later in terms of, here's a link to the PowerFx test engine GitHub repository. Use that as a way of saying what's most important for you, because we actively look at the content there and we're actively looking to engage there. A lot of it's been kind of a one-sided conversation so far. It's like, hey, this is what we're doing, we're working on all these features. But as we move towards preview, we want this to be a two-way conversation, and drive a community around this in terms of how is this improving the quality of what you're doing.
Awesome.
And we didn't get a chance to talk about how awesome PowerCat are, of course. And your PowerCat tools, being able to do, testing, it seems to be a kind of a running theme through everything that's been working on, like the API testing and then Copilot Studio. It seems to be a very big focus point for what you're doing in that team. Yeah,
we use the Power Platform to go deliver tools for the community to use. And as we do that, we've got to go test what we do. So we use all the tools we're doing. And that's the reason I'm kind of involved with Test Engine. Is my whole thing in being in Test Engine is to say, how do we as a team use the Power Platform tools to improve the quality of what we give to the community to use? So it's kind of a virtuous loop there, that we're using everything we're doing here to help improve the quality of all those tools that we work as the PowerCat engineering team.
Yeah, dog fooding.
Yeah.
Always good. Well, Scott, that's how our listener. It's a great episode. Awesome stuff. I want to go out and get all the links and look at it and watch that video. But we've reached our end here. So how can our listeners get a hold of us, Scott, if they have additional questions?
Yeah, you can email us, cast@XrmToolbox.com. Get us on socials @XrmToolcast. We'd love to hear from you. It's been an absolute pleasure having you, Grant. And like Daryl says, there is multiple episodes here of stuff, and it's really, really exciting. And I can't wait to see how far it goes and all the next steps. Thank you so much for coming on and telling us all about that.
Yes, thank you for sharing.
Well, thanks for having me. And looking forward for people to get hands-on and giving us feedback as they try it.
Awesome. Well, appreciate it very much, Grant. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you later.
Cheers.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
This has been the XrmToolCast with Daryl Labar and Scott Durrell. Produced by Lynn Zawin. If you have any questions or suggestions, please send them to cast@xrmtoolbox.com, tweet @XrmToolCast, or hit us up on our LinkedIn XrmToolCast page.